So taking a look into the Japanese meta shows us a very different prospect than what we're used to in the West. And I think that really is the most interesting part of this video.
What are you trying to tell me? That I can dodge bullets?
Trying to tell you that when you're ready, you won't have to.
So, for the first round of losers, we have Nao's Mario versus Hero's Bowser. I've been told it's pronounced Hero. I'm going to stick to that pronunciation for this video. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. Anyway, let's get into the theme for this set, and it is about the styles of information gathering. And the reason why I choose this as a theme is a little bit complex, so let's start at the beginning. I think one of the most important things in Smash, obviously, is gathering information. You want to make informed decisions, right? It's kind of like in RPS, the first round, you are more likely to play around rock because men are more likely to pick rock, right? So in RPS against another man, you would be more likely to pick paper. It's a bit of metagaming, right? So we have this information about likely options, and that is going to inform our decision making. Now, in a game like RPS, where all the outcomes are equal, having that small advantage is huge. This translates very well to Smash, though it gets a lot more complex. So to simplify it a little bit, I identify three main styles of information gathering. I call them commitment, coverage, and movement. So these all exist on a bit of a spectrum where the more committal an option, the more relevant the information, right? So when we see Hero play, he will commit a lot to his options, but that also means that he gets very relevant information every single time. Let's say Hero does a jump in forward air. What really are your options in terms of stopping him? You could interrupt him, you can, try to shield it, you can try to roll in. It kind of stops there, right? You can whiff punish. So there are very limited outcomes. So the quality of information is very high, but the risk is also very high. That is committal information gathering, what Hero prefers, and also something that Bowser is quite good at, because once he gets that information, the punishes that he gets off of that information, the leverage is insane. On the other side, we have Nao, who focuses more on coverage-heavy information gathering. Now, coverage is a lot less committal, which also means that the information you get is a lot less high quality, right? The quality, well, the actionability of the information is less extreme. So when we think about, for example, now covering the airspace by whiffing a back air, what could Hero have done about that? Well, he could have not done anything. He could have dashed back. He could have rolled in. He could have jumped away. He could have tried to whiff punish. He could have tried to contest. He could have shielded. There's so many things he could have done about it, including just not contesting at all. In other words, the outcomes are very varied, which means that the information is harder to parse, right? It is more it is less binary information. Then the final option that I discussed was movement, which, as you can imagine, it's the least committal option, but also the least intensive in terms of information gathering, right? When you're moving, your opponent's not really forced to do anything. There's a lot of possible outcomes. If you want to see movement-based information gathering, I recommend watching a little bit of Tweak. He's really, really good at that. Anyway, back to this set, we see that in a lot of these early games especially, Hero controls the match by forcing information gathering around his committal playstyle. Now, the thing about this committal playstyle is that while you control a lot of the information, like we said, you also incur a lot of risk. So you're also giving your opponent a lot of information. And we see throughout this set that Nao gets better and better at reading into these commitments, at using that information that's given. And this is a very natural progression of these styles. The committal style might be explosive. It can come on really, really strong as you grab control over the game through your committing, through the information you get off of that. You capitalize. But as the set progresses, more patterns come up, and the player who was more coverage heavy, who's taking less risks, can adjust his coverage to cover for the risks that you're taking, to find that balance between covering multiple of your styles of commitment at once. That's exactly what Nao does. As he improves and improves throughout the set, we can see him wait for these committal options. We can see him preemptively beat them out, and eventually he takes the win over Hero and advances. Moving into losers semis, it is Yoshi Dora versus Zakrey. A very, very interesting matchup. Yoshi's versus Pit, something that you would never see this late into a bracket in the Western scene. And we actually didn't expect to see this in Japan either, but here he is, Zakrey, rocking the Pit, making it all the way here. And I think this, again, lets us build upon a point that we talked about in a previous analysis, and it is about that movement in the air as well as your mobility on the ground. So I think Yoshi, as a character, very limited in his ground game, right? Very much an aerial character. Now, the nice thing about Yoshi's air game is that because of his maneuverability, it is not as committed as most air games. However, there's one little bit of a caveat, and that is that you cannot shield in the air. So in that sense, there is still a huge vulnerability, which a character like Pit is actually really good at abusing, right? Pit is really good at doing, for example, like a jump in Nair, using the disjoint as well as the movement, the precise movement from the ground to position that Nair properly and anti-air you. So what we see is that the theme of this set is the importance of ground game, because it's not like Zakrey is on the ground all the time. It is the interplay between ground and air game. And in the example that I just described, we can see this in action. So let's dissect it a little bit. We talked about Yoshi Dora being unable to shield in the air, right? And Zakrey using grounded movement to then set up an aerial move. And this is the core interplay that people should strive for as they rise through the skill levels. What I mean by this is that oftentimes what you see at top level play is that they treat their ground game purely for positioning. It's not like they're moving somewhere to hit someone. They're moving somewhere because on the ground you can move at a lower commitment while also having more options available to you, because from the ground you can always go into the air, as well as having one of the only frame one options in the game, which is shielding, right? As well as all the options that come from shielding. So on the ground, you can move into positions at a relatively low commitment cost. And from there, a lot of the time, again, at top level, what you see is that they move on the ground and then they enter the air from there, and then they use their drift to mix up their movement further. In other words, a core component of top level play is the flexibility of movement, of always making it hard for your opponent to understand where you're going to be. And what you find then is that at top level play, people will start to hit you not where you are, but where you could be, which is again something we talked about in the previous set with a cola placing his hitboxes in places Ashimo could be, and if he wasn't going to be there, he would be safe due to that, that property of Steve, that movement. So when you see people start to aim for where you could be, what's better, being on the ground or being in the air? That's where being on the ground becomes a lot more important. So that ground play is really, really movement heavy, whereas the air game is more about, well, one, covering yourself while moving, right? So what you see, for example, from a cola especially, but also Zakrey, is that they will use retreating jumps while doing like a rising aerial, because the aerial acts as a sort of replacement shield to protect them as they move, right? But mostly the ground movement is used for that movement, and then the air game is used to capitalize on the position that you just gained. Now, of course, it's not like ground moves are never used, but the ground moves, they are more of a reactionary tool, right? So think about like a forward tilt whiff punish from Zakrey, right? That is just very committal. Think about a dash attack, that is very committal. And even some of the tools that we traditionally see as less committal tools, think about something like a Roy down tilt. Roy down tilt feels very uncommittal, right? Very low commitment. However, you're still staying in the same position for at least 20-ish frames. And that might not seem like a long time, but that gives your opponent a moment to react to your current position, know that you are going to be there by the time they finish reacting, and then plan their actions based on the possible situations that could result from that. Whereas if someone dashes, by the time you react to the dash is long over. In fact, they could have done 2 dashes by the time you react to a singular dash, which means that while someone is moving on the ground, you cannot react to their exact position. And you're always, in a lot of ways, you're always at least 10 frames behind, because a dash is about 10 frames and you react in 20, right? So by the time you react, they're already 10 frames further into a possible future. Whereas in the air, because the possible positions out of being in the air are so much more limited than the possible positions out of being on the ground, it is a lot easier to, like we talked about in the Yoshidora versus Ashimo set, you can confirm a certain moment of movement and from there make a very informed decision, especially a character like Yoshi, who unfortunately has a lackluster fastfall due to being a little bit floaty, right? Fastfall is a multiplier, so oftentimes floaty characters fastfall a little bit less fast than fastfallers themselves do, as well as having a subpar double jump, right? If Yoshi had Crom double jump, his air game would actually be a lot better, in neutral at least, in terms of mixing up his positioning, because suddenly there's a range of vertical mix-ups that become more accessible. So what we see is that Zakrey is a lot better at keeping his movement unpredictable and converting that unpredictability into good situations, while Yoshidora has to commit harder because he prefers to be in the air so much. And from Zakrey, this mix of ground, air, right? Using the ground game to move flexibly, using the air game to commit on that, or like we said before, using hitboxes to guard himself while he moves through the air. Those are all very, very powerful aspects of this set. And as a small aside, this is pretty interesting, but Pit, one of the few characters who does have a shield in the air in that down B, which makes his air game a lot less committal than other characters do, as well as having multiple jumps, which again adds a lot of vertical mix-ups. So we even see when Zakrey does take to the air, he has some advantages that Yoshidora doesn't have. And we'll see more about that in the next set, which should be Ashimo versus Zakrey. But for now, let's celebrate this victory from Zakrey, rocking that pit, shutting down a titan of the Japanese Smash scene, Yoshidora, and advancing to the next round.
高いダメージが取ったがダッシュ攻撃
Moving into the climax of the event, grand finals, it is a cola versus Ashimo. They fought in winners finals, which was kind of a wash in a cola's favor. However, Ashimo does manage to win grand finals number 1, and it is through a very simple concept. We talked a lot about what you should do, why you should do these things, thinking about good situations, thinking about creating these, thinking about shutting down your opponent from creating them, all sorts of RPS. And what Ashimo teaches us in the first set of grand finals is that when is often more important than what. So you can know exactly what your opponent is going to do, but if you don't know when they're going to do it, how do you stop them? If you're too early interrupting someone while they're moving, you could be committing preemptively and getting whiff punished. If you're too late, you're giving them time to set up the good situation. There are a lot of variables, not just in what you want to do, but also when you should be doing it. Ashimo in this set really creates these pauses in his gameplay to give a-cola room to commit first. And here's where he turns the table. We talked before about how Ryu is not super scary in terms of burst range, right? He can create these good situations, but he doesn't often win a situation from mid-range. It's not like a grenade ninja or pit, he hits you with dash attack, he wins the situation. More often than not, Ryu wins the situation by creating a good one, right? So from the mid-range, he jumps in, gets a good situation. So what he does instead in these mid-range situations is he gives a little bit of a pause because, surprise, surprise, Steve can also struggle with doing this from the mid-range. So by adding this little bit of a pause, he's not taking too much risk, because for a-cola to actually win the situation from that pause requires quite a bit of commitment. And as we've seen before, a-cola doesn't want to commit. As we saw, he played very defensively around these possible approaches while covering Ashimo, relying more on shield. Ashimo now relies a little bit less on shield and adds a little bit more of these pauses, right? Because when he's shielding, these pauses don't mean a lot because he's so limited. So he doesn't shield, instead he approaches and he creates these pauses, knowing that if a-cola wants to punish him for doing so, a-cola generally has to commit decently hard. And what we see is through this structure, as well as some early kills that Ashimo found and picked up very well, Ashimo gets the win in Grand Final Set 1. Afterwards, we move into Grand Finals Set 2, and Ashimo starts the set off with another dominating victory, right? Taking the first game, but then a-cola switches gears. And this is where we get into the theme of our final set for this video, and the theme is RPS options are not created equal. So we see Ashimo, he stops shielding. We see that Ashimo starts adding these delays into his gameplay. And all of this is to mess with a-cola's rhythm, right? To basically say it doesn't matter what options you pick, the only thing that matters is when I do it, right? So in the second grand finals, a-cola says, well, Ashimo, you made a lot of adaptations on a psychological level, right? So on a psychological level, he is stopping the shield, right? So he's throwing a-cola for a loop. He is adding these pauses. In other words, like adding a pause on paper, it's not good. The risk reward is not great. Your reward is low, your risk is high. These are all adaptations that only work because of the psychological aspect of Smash. And a-cola says, well, let's throw all this off of the table. Let's just play good RPS. Let's just play the game without the influence of all of these psychological factors. I'm just going to pick options that are objectively good. And through doing that, he finds all of these high reward situations, all of these high reward conversions. And through that, he takes a very solid victory over Ashimo in the second set of grand finals, a 3-0 and a dominant one at that, after dropping just a single game and picking himself up in a huge way. So taking a look into the Japanese meta shows us a very different prospect than what we're used to in the West. And I think that really is the most interesting part of this video. The Japanese focus on safety and lack of willingness to commit leads to good play patterns and bad play patterns. I think what we've seen in this top 8 is a healthy mix of both, but especially some of the weaknesses. I think the reason why the Japanese scene is seen as such a strong scene on average is that focus on safety, which a lot of the mid-level players in Western scenes don't have, leading to them being a lot easier to exploit as players. Whereas in Japan, exploiting a player takes a few extra steps because you got to get them out of that comfort zone, out of that defensive play first, which can be hard, right? It can be very, very hard given certain matchups. So on the other hand, we see the top level players in the West, especially, the American continent, we see them outperform their Japanese counterparts relatively consistently. And a big part of that is because they are more willing to take risks. They're more willing to commit when needed. And that is the essence of a game like Smash, is that you gather information ideally safely, and then you apply that information into smart commitments, smart risks. And I feel like the Japanese playstyle can be a little bit too focused on how do I converge into a more safe playstyle, something that is more consistent, something that has very little variety, or I should say very little variance, right? And that small amount of variance is a good thing in most of the bracket, but when you start entering top 8, it gets worse and worse. That is not to say that Japan is weak. I think Japan is absolutely the strongest scene in the world right now, but for them to really establish the top level dominance, they would have to start taking more smart risks and think about how to convert information into actions more intelligently. Of course, they play a lot of characters that have to do a little bit less of this. Think about the way Ashimo plays Ryu, very defensive, right? Very much focused on how do you open me up, not how do I take smart risks to open you up, which ended up being his downfall. As well as a cola, again, playing a character that's just inherently a very defensive character. So we see the top Japanese players succeed with these characters because it fits their playstyle. And again, I think, let's be fair about this, I think there's something to learn both ways, right? Japanese players have things to learn from the Western scene, and the Western scene has things to learn from Japanese players. However, for now, this is going to be it. Another top 8, another set of interesting lessons and themes. Hope you guys enjoyed. Be sure to support the channel, and of course, stay smart.